This lecture and the next lecture I want to give some examples about this question of vulnerability and how it works in particular places. This lecture I want to talk about vulnerability to climate change in a small island state called Niue, which is a single island in the South Pacific. Niue, by way of an introduction, is the world's largest and highest single coral atoll called a macacia. And so a low-lying atoll of which I've shown you pictures of, like Funafuti in Tuvalu or Madura on the Marshall Islands, elevated out of the sea, comes out looking like a rock like this sort of shape. And the highest point in Niue is 55 metres above sea level. So it's an atoll that's been pushed up. Niue has 260 square kilometres of land and a fairly small exclusive economic zone. If you can see it, Niue is about there. That's Niue, that little light blue square there. It's bordered to the north by American Samoa, to the east by the Cook Islands, to the west by Tonga. So it's a single island with a small exclusive economic zone. It has a reef, an uninhabited reef, as part of its EEZ. Polynesian people live in Niue, a language that is part of the Polynesian language group. To get there, the plane flies once a week from Auckland. It's about a 4-hour flight. Niue is an interesting place. It's the world's smallest state. It has a little over 1,500 people. 80% of them are Niuean, born in Niuean and identify as Niueans. Politically, it's self-governing in free association with New Zealand. So what that means is that Niue doesn't have a seat in the United Nations General Assembly, and it doesn't control its own passport system, so Niueans hold New Zealand passports, but it's responsible for its international affairs in many other realms. And New Zealand is responsible for its defence. But Niue is a party to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, for example. It's a party to the Convention on Biodiversity. It's a party to various United Nations treaties. So it's sovereign in a sense as its right to represent itself in international affairs in most forums, if not the UN General Assembly. So this is a form of partial decolonisation. It's a very, very small economy. Gross domestic product is about $15 million US. GDP per capita is about $10,000 US. So Niueans, by no means, it's by no means the least developed country. $10,000 US per person in a household of about 2.5 people per household in an economy where property can't be bought and sold means that you can have a pretty decent living, actually. The economy is very heavily influenced by the government and the resources, the money that the government has in which it influences the economy because it's the major employer, for example. Just about everybody in Niue has an income, every household in Niue has an income from the government. The government's money comes from New Zealand aid primarily. And of that GDP per capita, a fair bit of it is subsistence production that isn't exchanged in markets. About 80 cents of every dollar that enters Niue comes from New Zealand aid in one form or another. So it's a very interesting place and a very interesting economy. It's a society that was settled perhaps 1,000 or more years ago by Polynesian migrants. They've been living there ever since. One of the interesting social facts or social dimensions of Niue is a problem of population decline. The Premier in 2003 said, and this captures the thinking quite well, there are serious concerns that if our population drops much lower, then the very things that make us a nation, such as our spiritualism, our language, our heritage, and our social values, will be threatened. And I say this because if we're thinking about social vulnerability, it's important to think about the way climate change might impact the things that are important to people, the things that they say are important to them. And one of the big problems in Niue is population decline. And so it behoves us to think, is climate change likely to have an effect on population decline if this is something that's important to them? And I'll say a few things about this along the way. So this is a graph of Niue's population up until the 1970s when you see the peak. Population was okay, and the population of Niue historically probably fluctuated between 4,000 and 5,000 people. Then in 1971, an international airport was opened and population began to decline quite rapidly, and is more or less continued to decline through to the present day, although it appears to be stabilising at about 1,500 people. That depends a bit on the proportion that are Niuean or not. There's some migrants who come and go. In fact, the Niue's population story is a very interesting one. It is one of a big long-term churn. People leave, and they leave for quite long periods of time, but then they come back. Nevertheless, big fall in population. So that the population of Niueans looks something like this. There are 20,000 or so Niueans living in New Zealand, about 1,500 in Australia, and about 1,200 in Niue. So there are more Niueans living in Australia and very, very more Niueans living in New Zealand than there are in Niue. Of all the people born in Niue, about 4 times as many live in New Zealand than live in Niue. It's very interesting. What does it make other people in New Zealand Niueans? What can they claim to be Niue? They speak the language and they know the songs and the dances. Are they Niuean even if they don't live in Niue? Or is there something about the people who live in the island that makes them different from the people who live in New Zealand? There is, and what it is the way they live their lives. The New Zealanders in Niue can't go to the bush and grow their taro. The New Zealanders in Niue can't get in their boats and go fishing. They can't glean for resources off the reef. They don't spend all day in the church the way, and Sundays in the church the way people in Niue do, and so on. So what makes the Niueans in Niue distinct from the Niueans in New Zealand is the way they live in the island. That's an important thing to remember. So what matters to Niueans is about retaining population and ideally about growing the size of the population of Niueans living in Niue. This thing about what makes Niueans on the island distinct is captured in the idea of Taonga Niue. Taonga means the precious treasures of that place. The language, the traditional culture as they would define it, the way they live their life, their links and their use of the land and the sea, the mangafoa, the extended family, and those kinship networks that I referred to earlier. Spiritual values are important. They're very spiritual people, and they live in villages, and that's an important part of the way their life is organised. Niue is famous also for its coconut crabs called unga. This is one here. It's on a leash because you don't want to get bitten by one, although they don't move very fast. Okay, so that's a little bit about Niue. What does climate change mean for Niue? Well, it's going to get warmer to some degree. Rainfall is going to change to some degree, not particularly helpful, but it would appear that, and the issue really on Niue is about the distribution of rainfall events over the course of the year. So the surface of Niue is very porous, it's limestone, it has very shallow soils, and water, as soon as it lands on the island, drains away. There's no surface water, there's no lakes and no rivers. The ability then to grow crops depends on maintaining soil moisture, which is quite difficult in a hot climate, and it requires fairly regular rainfall. This is an important dimension of climate, so food production is quite sensitive to rainfall. Cyclones are a significant problem in Niue. Niue has a major cyclone, major as in category 5, very big, knocks everything down cyclone about every 10 years. And so the concern in Niue too, not just about precipitation, is also about this frequency and intensity of cyclones, which can be a real problem. Sea level rise is an issue, but Niue doesn't actually have many beaches. It's a very rocky coast. Coral bleaching is a problem for Niue, and ocean acidification also will be a problem. I'm going to talk in this lecture about cyclones and drought mostly. Here's a chart of annual rainfall in Niue from 1950 through to 2004, and you can see some big rainfall events where rainfall declines around 1984, around 1999, and these are typically tied to ENSO events in the South Pacific. And when these periods of rainfall fall, food production drops away very significantly. And a big part of food consumption in Niue is from own produce. I have a survey of all households in Niue, and on average, households eat taro, locally grown, tuber, at least twice a day. And they eat fish at least 5 times a week. So their principal form of protein is fish caught in the sea. Their principal form of carbohydrates is taro, which is grown locally, but which doesn't grow in very dry years. And tends to grow very poorly in periods where there are prolonged periods without rainfall on the island. In the past, drought caused famine in Niue. 5,000 people, thin soils, fairly shallow, fairly lack of diversity of foodstuffs, and indeed at various times Niue has had kings, and typically the end of those kings has been brought about by drought that's ushered in famine. The king was killed and everybody goes back to living in villages. So it requires a surplus to maintain a kingship structure And Niue's never had enough of a food surplus to be able to do that. So sensitive to drought. Very sensitive to cyclones too. The last major cyclone was in 2004 called Cyclone Heta, and it caused massive damage and a lot of trauma across the population as well. So it damaged all the tree crops, everything was stripped off the trees. Niue was trying very hard to develop an export industry of organic vanilla, which is a fairly sensible thing to try and develop for that economy. It's a high value product that you can export large quantities of at fairly low shipping costs. The Niues liked to garden. There was a population of people who were developing a very good vanilla crop, and it was looking very good, and it looked like it would produce a significant amount of money for quite a large number of households. And Cyclone Heta came through and completely destroyed that vanilla crop and set its development back 4 years or so, and discouraged a lot of people from getting into this enterprise again. Heta caused a lot of damage to the reefs around Niue, which were only just recovering from a previous cyclone and an El Nino event. That has an impact on reef fisheries, and it has potentially an impact on the health and toxicity of fish as well. Very rocky, steep coastline, and so the ability to go fishing requires wharves to launch boats and tracks in which to carry boats down to the sea. And Heta damaged all that fishing infrastructure too. So a lot of fishing goes on. Fish is a cheap, healthy form of food for people in Niue, and after Cyclone Heta, the ability to catch fish significantly declined simply because people couldn't get their boats into the water. So here's some pictures. These are the bulk fuel storage tanks. You can get a sense of the size of these. There's little ladders running up them to give you an idea. Now these were all reasonably full during Cyclone Heta. They're about 20 metres above sea level, and they were pushed off their base and all the fuel spilled out by a couple of waves. Those are very big cyclone to produce waves of that size capable of producing a thing that big full of fuel. So you can imagine what the houses along the coast happened to them. The main cultural area and government area of Niue was a strip called the Golden Mile. It contained the cultural centre, the museum, a stage where people would meet, and everybody across the island would often come on a Friday or Saturday night, and they would engage in traditional dances and just commingle and share experiences and so on. And all that infrastructure was damaged, and so suddenly there's nowhere to go for everybody to go on a Friday night. The museum lost its artefacts and so on. 43 houses were completely washed away. 90% of all houses on the island were damaged. Major re-roofing was required. The hospital was completely destroyed. And this is a really significant psychosocial problem. So the people who live in Niue were all born in the hospital. And that hospital had been there for a very long time. It's a really good thing. You know, I was born in the hospital was one way for people to say, I'm a Niuean. And the hospital wasn't there anymore. It was a loss. The library was destroyed. The museum and all its collection was lost. And these collections included really significant things like the warriors from the olden days had long hair. The hair of the ancestor who was a warrior would be passed on from generation to generation. Some of that was in the museum and was lost. Artefacts and so on. So for a country where people are migrating in a fairly large degree, hanging on to their identity and their history and their culture is a hard thing to do. To have this loss of the museum is very significant. The estimated cost of damages of Cyclone Heta was 3 times gross domestic product. But coming back to the migration story, after Cyclone Heta, the New Zealand newspapers, who like nothing better than to make disparaging comments about people in the Pacific Islands, ran a series of headlines that said, this will be it, everybody will leave, this is the end of Niue, population over, last person out, turn off the lights, kind of heading like that. In fact, Cyclone Heta had no significant change on population movement from Niue. So the big bar there is the number of people leaving in 2002, about 85. You can see in 2003 it was about 30, in 2004 of the cyclone it was 28, 2005, in fact only 20 people left. There was no signal on population movement from the cyclone. The people who stay in Niue are staying in Niue. It's called the Rock of Polynesia, and they cling to the rock, and it's part of who they are. So population movement doesn't appear in this case to be sensitive to climate. The people who are going to leave have left, the people who are going to stay no matter what. Drought too is another problem. Staple crops are not irrigated. There's no surface water, and so it's not possible to divert streams or build lakes or dams. A month of no rain affects all food plants, and taro, which is the main food crop. Everybody eats it. It grows very well, and Niuean pink taro is a good taro. They used to export this. Other people in Polynesia like Niuean taro. It's very sensitive to soil moisture deficits, and 2 weeks of rain can affect the growth of taro. And in very bad years, a country that has a massive surplus production of taro, Niuean pigs are very well fed on taro, went from being a massive surplus producer to having to import taro. A big turnaround because of simply a lack of rainfall. And what does this mean? So drought means that those people who export taro lose their income from doing so. That's not a major activity, but it has been in the past. It means that they have to substitute for taro. They're not consuming as much of it with other things, and typically they're things that they have to pay for in shops. Food, imported food, is very expensive in Niue. It has to travel a long way. It doesn't keep very well. So people typically substitute taro for rice when they don't have taro. It's not as healthy, it increases their cost of living, and it changes the balance of payments. So what can they do about these problems? Interesting to think. So we've talked about exposure and sensitivity, at least around cyclone and droughts. Let's talk about adaptation. There was a discussion after Heta about relocating the villagers who live close to the coast further inland and higher. And this actually is what happened with the hospital. The New Zealand government decided that they would build a new hospital in a higher and safer location, and it cost some millions of dollars, in the order of $8 or $9 million, certainly beyond the economy of the government of Niue. But that hasn't happened for households, and that hasn't happened for villages. And it's very difficult to relocate villages because of the way land is allocated. People in Niue have bush blocks where they grow their food, and they have small blocks to which they're entitled to live on in a patchwork of allocation amongst families in villages. And simply reconstituting that pattern of land tenure to move a village is very difficult to do. Yet people want to live in villages. They live around a village green with the church. Most social activities are organised around the village. So simply distributing the households and villages into random locations around the island would have a big social impact. Nobody wants that. But removing and repatterning the geographic form of a village is very difficult because of land tenure. This is the hospital. The new hospital was being built. One way of doing this is for the government to acquire land of certain families and distribute that land to build a new village, but that's very difficult. The government, the families that own land tend not to enjoy their relationships with government around buying and acquiring land. It doesn't work very well. And for a family to sell its land to the government would require the consent of everybody in the extended family, which is vast, includes people living in New Zealand and Australia, and very hard to do. There is an example of a village relocation in the past in Niue, a village called Vaia, which moved up from the coast further inland sometime, I can't quite recall when, maybe 80 to 90 years ago. And it was reconstituted on the land of one single landowner, which created quite a lot of political difficulties within the village about people who are effectively occupying somebody else's land with their permission, but nevertheless creates problems of dependence, which is quite difficult. And finally, of course, moving is a very expensive option. It costs a couple of $100,000 to build a new house in Niue, and that's beyond the means of almost everybody. So moving villages isn't really an adaptation option. The capacity to do so isn't there. For drought too, the adaptation options are slightly constrained. Niue has an abundance of fresh water and has a freshwater lens that's up to 40 metres thick, but it's about 20 or 30 metres down, and so the problem of accessing water is a problem of pumping water, which is an energy problem. So for households and for businesses and hospitals and so on, water is pumped up, put into header tanks and stored. But the cost of pumping water in Niue accounts for about a quarter of all electricity use. Water is free and abundant, but it's below ground, and the problem is getting it, and that's an energy problem. And energy is hard to come by in Niue. It's diesel generated electricity, and the diesel has to be imported, and that's expensive and difficult. This is an example of the freshwater lens. So it's deep down. This is a cave. Prior to colonisation, people would walk down in the caves to get water, and so they had to live near places where you could access the groundwater. And here's a water tank. So irrigation isn't really possible. It's too expensive to get the water, and agriculture is a shift in cultivation, and so it's not like you can put in a sprinkler system and it's going to irrigate the crop every year, because the crop has to move because the soils are shallow and depleted easily. There are different kinds of cultivars of taro that are more or less drought resistant. And so one option here to maintain food supply is to grow different kinds of taro and eat in drought periods those that are less sensitive to declining rainfall, drought resistant forms of taro. But people don't like very much those more drought resistant forms of taro. They like the taste of pink taro. So this is not a culturally particularly preferred option. There are other drought tolerant crops that do grow in Niue that people could eat, cassava for example, but people don't particularly like to eat cassava either. They like their pink taro, and if they can't get it, they'd rather have rice than another form of taro or cassava. There are other adaptation options. There are many other climate risks in Niue. I'm just trying to give you an insight into some of the vulnerabilities and the adaptation issues. So Niue is vulnerable to climate change, but it's not vulnerable for the same reason you might think other islands are. Sea level rise isn't a particular problem. In fact, there's an abundance of fresh water for drinking. The conclusion of this analysis, the sort of bottom line about the vulnerability assessment in Niue, is that the risks of climate change will manifest themselves in increasingly expensive cyclone damage or a lot more money spent to avoid it. Increasing dietary problems arising through losses of cheaper and more abundant local foods, taro and fish in particular. And if taro doesn't grow so well and is more difficult and catching fish is more difficult and so on, then the things that make Niueans Niuean, that distinguishes them from Niueans in New Zealand or other people living in New Zealand, start to become a bit less prevalent and a bit less easy to practice, and that will have some implications for how the Niueans identify themselves. If the things that make people Niuean are less easy to enjoy, and if it costs more money to buy food, if it costs people more money to protect their houses, if taxes rise to pay for new infrastructure developments and so on, so if climate change imposes costs on people, such that the cost of living in Niue seem to be higher than the cost of living in New Zealand, then this too might change the question about how many people choose to stay in Niue.